The challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. A 16-year-old high school student was rushed to a Los Angeles area hospital for emergency treatment after he was attacked by other students. The reason? He was Asian American, and he was being blamed for the COVID-19 pandemic. Other Asian Americans have been spit on, sworn at, struck, and even stabbed. Each is part of a rising number of hate crimes, including right here in Western Washington. This pattern and what can be done to stop it is the subject of this week's Challenge 2.0, when one virus spawns another. And we'd like to welcome our guests in this week's episode of Challenge 2.0. Our guests this week include Kathy Sheh, a lifelong resident of Seattle, who is both a theater artist and a City of Seattle employee. She has focused much of her energy and her considerable abilities on the problem of color systemic racism. Kathy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
And our other guest is one, well, certainly very familiar to anybody who has watched Seattle television news over the past few decades. That's the retired and Emmy Award-winning King 5 news anchor and journalist Lori Matsukawa. And I'm pleased to say a colleague of mine for many, many years. Lori, thank you so much for joining us as well.
Thanks, Jeff. It's been great all these years.
Well, in our introduction, we talked about some of the instances that have been reported of aggression against Asian Americans. I might begin by asking both of you, what are some of the most recent and the most troubling examples that you've either witnessed or heard about?
Well, Jeff, I think the most recent events has been the reemergence of the use of the slur Wuhan virus, Chinese virus, or Kung flu by the president. I don't want to get into politics or anything like that, but hearing these kinds of terms used by the president of the United States is very disturbing and hurtful to Asian Americans, and it leads to a sort of permission to use these kinds of slurs in public among just ordinary citizens, and it can lead to harassment and other kinds of injurious interactions between people.
I mean, we've seen a lot of these incidents happening over this entire pandemic, and even before the pandemic started, but there's always been a heightened instance whenever we hear the president speaking out about this way, or I actually prefer to call him the occupant in the White House. But, you know, we have seen people who have, there's been, over 1,900 cited incidents, and that's just what's been reported, of people getting spit on, kicked, side slammed, having their pets attacked along with the person, people, a woman getting acid thrown into her face when she was taking out her garbage. These are incidents that are happening all over the country in nearly every area of this country. And this is something that has really reemerged during this time, but it's because, as Lori said, even the person in the White House is giving credence to it and actually, in some ways, spurring it on.
Well, it is such a problem that there is actually a website that is trying to collect data on all of these incidents, because data speaks when it comes to making policy and making decisions. And there is a website called Stop AAPI Hate. And what you do is, if there's an incident that involves you or someone you know, you go to that website and register what kind of harassment you experienced. And they range from a lot of different microaggressions, from being shunned, like you go to the store and people don't help you in the store, or they toss your loose change back to you very rudely, treated rudely, or being the target of really hateful or inconsiderate comments like, "Go back to where you came from, you bat eater," those kinds of comments. And even benign comments can be a microaggression, like, oh, you speak English really well, even though you're maybe a fourth, fifth generation person
Mhm.
who's lived here your whole life. So they even had to create an entirely new kind of aggression called being spat upon or coughed upon, because there were so many reports of that kind of harassment.
I
So
might just ask both of you, I think this might not be a surprise in other communities, but here in the Seattle metro area, Western Washington, we've had a culturally and ethnically diverse population for a long time. I know my wife and I have lived here now 40 plus years, and that diversity was just sort of part of the richness of living here. And yet we're seeing a lot of these cases. Ballard was one that has been cited, and also the International District. You've cited some general senses. Were there any specifics that really have stuck out in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, locally, in the International District, for instance, a lot of the businesses immediately experienced a huge decline in people patronizing their restaurants. And this was before the stay-at-home orders went into
Mhm.
effect. It was a dramatic effect, but one particular restaurant, Jade Garden, which has long had a pretty busy clientele, especially on weekends for dim sum, they had a huge drop in business. But what became worse is when the stay-at-home orders went into effect, all of a sudden there were no more eyes on the street, and they were no longer in the restaurant, and so they experienced a break-in. All their windows are broken, so then the neighborhood came together and put up really beautiful murals on the wooden boards. But then it was broken into like three. They've experienced 3 break-ins so far, and the most recent one was breaking in and actually stealing the cash register. And you could say that, oh, well, a lot of businesses have been experiencing that. If you actually look at the data in Seattle, the International District Chinatown has experienced a dramatic increase of that, and also people being harassed himself personally. And I know Lori has knows a lot about the personal experience that Eric has gone through, the owner of Jade Garden.
right. What happened to Eric was because he went to the media and talked about what was happening to his family's restaurant, their business, he started getting trolled on social media. And so he was so attacked. He really felt fear. He feared for his life. It was that serious. And these online trolls were relentless and definitely racist and
Mhm.
definitely frightening.
They
So
actually started posting posts using his picture that they had stolen off of social media as if it was him, really putting really derogatory comments as if it was coming from him. And that led to a huge backlash from the community against him, but it wasn't him that was posting these. So that was the kind of
Right.
insidious experiences he was going through in his restaurant.
but Jeff, right in this town, a friend of mine who's working for a major medical center here in town said that it's come to the point where patients coming to this center are refusing to be helped by Asian physicians. They say, "Oh, I don't want to be helped by that Asian." And some of the Asian physicians who are treating patients are spat upon and coughed upon as well.
I have heard, and I'd like your feedback on this, that there's been an element of shock within the Asian American community over white aggressions. Is that true? And if so, why was that unexpected?
Yeah, I mean, I've grown up here in Seattle, and I've experienced a lot of microaggressions and direct acts of racism against me my entire life here in Seattle.
Mhm.
But it's been a while. I mean, it's been a while since I've experienced that, as our community awareness has been expanding and growing over the last decade. But even just recently, before the stay-at-home orders went into effect, I was at the theater, and I was just clearing my throat, which I do regularly. And the gentleman next to me all of a sudden stiffened up. He looks over at me, and then he really loudly says something just like, "Some people," and he really loud voice, "some people obviously don't respect," like, and actually said, when especially when they're bringing in and carrying this disease, and spreading it to everybody. And he asked his wife if he wanted to leave. She forced him to stay because the curtains were going down. But the thing that wouldn't have bothered me so much, except then there were people all around us who were not Asian, who were coughing throughout the performance, and he didn't once even notice them. But the fact that an Asian woman next to him cleared her throat once before the show started, he made a huge point of that. It actually shocked me. And I think the reality is that a lot of, especially the younger Asian Americans growing up, we've gone through a generation here where we might not have had as many discriminatory acts against us as Asian Americans because we're perceived as the model minority, which is a myth. And so it can come as a surprise when you've kind of been able to navigate life. As a friend of mine has said, that lots of times she even forgets she's Asian or other until things like this happen. And then you're reminded very clearly of the fact that a lot of people still perceive us as perpetual foreigners.
What's interesting too is that earlier this year, I did a public service announcement with Police Chief Carmen Best because there were these anti-Asian events happening. And so she says, hey, Lori, let's do something together. So we did a little PSA. If you're harassed, call the police, report it, And it was amazing the kind of social media backlash and trolling that just came pouring out. I was called anti-American, anti-free speech, a weenie, because I couldn't take this kind of, a little insult. And, I was thinking, why is this happening? It never occurred to me that saying, if you're harassed, call the police would generate such animosity. It was really kind of mean. Yeah, it was mean.
It might even be worthwhile looking at what is the legitimacy of connecting COVID-19 with Asia, and certainly with Asian Americans. Any particular perspectives you'd offer on that?
For one thing, it's COVID-19. It's not the China flu or the China virus, or certainly not Kung flu and all of those other kinds of things. So even the World Health Organization says that we try not to name these diseases after specific countries or parts of the world because of this very reason. It becomes a scary thing and something that's used against people.
I mean, it would be one thing. The reality is that COVID-19 might have that particular strain might have started in China originally, but the reality was that if you look at the data right now, most recently, Europe has closed their doors to the United States, but they are actually allowing people from Japan, South Korea, and even China to go to Europe because the data shows that here in the United States, we have the greatest cases right now and the greatest prevalence. And because it hasn't been taken as seriously as it should be throughout this country, other countries are actually scared of us. So now in some ways, we're getting a taste of the kind of condemnation that we had placed where it originated, but that's not, they were able to contain it. We have not. So it'll be interesting to see what plays out in the next few months.
I'd like to go a little bit more in depth, and we alluded to this, I think, at the very beginning. Do you view this as primarily sort of a bottom-up response, the problem that people have with others who may not look like them, that might have culturally different practices? Is it more top-down, that it's being capitalized upon for political gain, or is it a mix of both of those?
I think it's a mix of both.
I agree. It is a mix of both, but it taps into this xenophobia, this fear of the other. When people hurl these slurs or treat people this way, it's like a fear of this other person, this stranger. And like I said earlier, some of these people have been here for 4, 5, 6 generations now. We aren't foreigners, we're Americans. And to be treated that way, makes you feel like a foreigner, someone who doesn't belong here. When they ask you questions like, oh, where are you from? Or where'd you come from? They don't mean Renton, or they don't mean Bellevue. They mean what country, and it's just a very disturbing vestige of this whole racism that has followed Asian Americans for over a century now here in this country. We've always been targets, we've always been others, and it just kind of rears its ugly head. These stereotypes come back, and comes to the point where you actually fear, I mean, I would actually fear for my safety. At first, before the mask order went out, by wearing a mask, I would think, am I, becoming a target because I'm an Asian with a mask and people are going to take that, hold that against me. So when it comes to the point where you fear for your safety, that's definitely not right.
Yeah, I agree. Ever since, like I said, I've grown up here in Seattle, so I have experienced this my entire life. I mean, it's a roller coaster. It kind of comes and goes. But with what the person in the White House has been saying has definitely exacerbated in this time period. But growing up here in Seattle, I have been spit upon. I have been told to go back to where I came from. I've been hit with a cane. Like really derogatory statements made against me. I've had people run because they were terrified of me. And this was when I was like 16. I mean, I've had all these different experiences throughout my life growing up here in Seattle, and it's a constant thing. So it's not just because of what's happening right now, but because that is the foundation of what a lot of people's perceptions are. And I think the most common one is really that no matter how many generations Asian Americans have been in this country, I mean, for some Japanese Americans, it's been 4, 5, 6 generations or more, we are still considered perpetual foreigners. And because of that, whenever there are situations that happen that then make it easy for us to be scapegoated, people always do. And I will say that I agree with Lori that despite all of that, I've never been scared in Seattle. I've never had a problem going out. I've always considered that, oh, those people are ignorant. They don't know anything. So it's never bothered me. But this is the first time, because of all the images we're seeing around the country of people being beat up. I mean, in Texas, a family of 3, 2 of them were toddlers, were stabbed by someone. And he said the reason why he stabbed them to try to kill them was because he was defending his state from the spread of this virus. So it's definitely so heightened right now, more than I've ever experienced in my lifetime, that I actually, for the first time in my life, was scared to actually leave my house. And every single time my husband would leave, I would just say, be careful out there, because I'm worried. He's more elderly than me, and I'm worried that he could get attacked, even though the stats right now are showing that the people who are attacking Asians and Asian Americans in our country, they're mostly attacking those who look more vulnerable. So a lot of women in particular, and kids are the ones who are getting the biggest backlash of this.
That's a very good point, because this website that I talked to, Stop AAPI Hate, has compiled several thousand incidents by now. And Dr. Russell Jung at San Francisco State University, who's kind of heading this effort, said that they show that women, Asian women, are 2.5 times more likely to be harassed. Also, the elderly and children.
Right.
So you have a very good reason for being afraid.
I want to talk about that a little bit more, but as we talk about that pattern and the fact that this extends back in history for some time, as you both alluded to, this is not something new. Can you give us a sense of the history, when this started to be part of the experience of Asian Americans or recent immigrants to this country?
Well, pretty much since the beginning of when Asians really started coming to this country. The biggest majority of people who first started coming were the Chinese, first to kind of find gold. But the majority were when actually railroad companies went to China to recruit cheap labor. Civil War had ended, so slavery was no longer a thing. And so they went to China to try to find cheap labor to come over to build the railroads. Once the railroads finished in the 1860s, things are fine. I mean, a lot of the Chinese then fell into doing jobs that no one else wanted, like being domestics and cooks and doing laundry. These are not jobs that other men wanted. But then all of a sudden our country fell into a depression in 1882. And that all of a sudden heightened the fact that, oh, look, these people are taking away our jobs. And there were huge riots and people protesting the government. And so the government actually issued Anti-Chinese Exclusion Act, where they actually said no more Chinese are allowed to come into this country. And then people weren't satisfied with that. So a lot of people here in Seattle, Tacoma and Olympia, they actually rounded up all the Chinese who lived here, and there were only several hundred at the time, rounded them all up and actually took them to our dock here in Seattle to try to put them on a boat to send them back to China, or to put them on a train to send them down to Tacoma and away from here, and then burned down. A lot of these areas got burned down so that they couldn't live here. And that was happening wherever there was Chinese. And then it goes on, right? After that was the internment of Japanese Americans. I don't know if, Laura, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, alien land laws that forbid any aliens from purchasing land. And there were also, as part of the Chinese Exclusion Act, you couldn't serve on a jury, you couldn't become a citizen. None of these immigrant groups really could become citizens of the United States. And this went on until almost 1960, right? Before, you know, some of the laws were changed to allow naturalization of immigrants. So it's been a very torturous and a very difficult history, very racist history. And we're kind of living with these echoes. And it has over time built up stereotypes about Asian Americans. It has, you know, created fears within certain populations. It's not been a very pleasant history. And things didn't really start to turn around until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You know, that's not very long ago. So we, you know, balance decades, maybe 100 years of racial discrimination over just a few decades of progress, if you will. So and it's a very sad history, really.
Yeah, I mean, and you can even see, like, in the 1980s when Japanese car sales started really taking off and more Americans are buying Japanese cars, there were layoffs in Detroit in the car industry. Then Vincent Chin was murdered because they thought he was Japanese. And they actually were reported as saying, you know, you're the reason why I lost my job. And then he was murdered. He was beaten by a bat by two white guys who just lost their jobs at Chrysler. And so we see this happening again and again. And I will say that the thing that seems to connect all the dots of when anti-Asian racism heightens is always due to economics. Whenever we've been in a recession, the incarceration of Japanese Americans, a lot of people say it was because Pearl Harbor happened. But actually, if you look at some of the documents that the FBI has and other things, a lot of it is actually based on a strategy that our government wanted to get us out of the war. I mean, get us into the war so that we could get out of the Depression. And so the incarceration of Japanese Americans was actually more about people in California who wanted the land that Japanese Americans were on and had. And it was a way to get rid of them strategically. So a lot of these have all been connected to when our country feels that they're losing economic access to things, that's when these things heighten.
That brings up, I think, a side point. Lori, I can't remember if this was something we've talked about recently or just sharing the news set, that when there was the excuse given that it was because of security during World War II and the internment process, there was actually a very different experience in Hawaii as opposed to mainland United States. Is that not correct? Do I remember that properly?
That's absolutely correct. On the West Coast, mainland United States, there was definitely a racist reason for removing Japanese from the West Coast, primarily getting their businesses and getting the land that they had cultivated into just very productive farmland. And so it was a kind of a plot to kind of get, to get land and businesses for pennies on the dollar from this population. And it was just really race-based. In Hawaii, where there were so many Japanese integrated into the economy of Hawaii, the state of Hawaii, or it wasn't a state back then, but Hawaii could not afford to lose all of these Japanese Americans and lock them up. Some people were, but even the US Navy, who was attacked at Pearl Harbor, said, you cannot incarcerate all these Japanese because we need them to work at the base. We need them to support agriculture and the war effort through the farming. You can't lock them up. So even the US Navy was protecting Japanese in Hawaii because of the war effort. They were necessary.
And so the irony, of course, is that is where Pearl Harbor happened. So the
Right.
fact that they were using this excuse of spies, possibility of Japanese Americans being spies, didn't make sense by what actually happened, where the Japanese in Hawaii were not incarcerated as a whole, but the ones in the West Coast were. And the distinction was the Japanese Americans in Hawaii didn't actually own land. They were the laborers that benefited the landowners, whereas on the mainland, the second generation, third generation Japanese Americans had been able to start buying land. And so this was a way to take the land away from them.
Right. Yeah, my grandfather ran a dairy. My mom's parents ran a dairy, so they were exempt. My uncles didn't have to go into the army. They had all the gasoline they needed for their milk trucks. They were part of the war effort.
Well, I would like to thank both of you for giving us a solid foundation of the history of the problem with the experience of Asian Americans, both in Western Washington, but throughout the United States, and some possible reasons for that. It's obvious there are so many other issues that we need to cover, including what non-Asian Americans can do to advocate for and ally themselves to help end this problem. So I hope that you'll join us for another episode of Challenge 2.0. We're going to be having a second edition of this next week. But for right now, we thank you for joining us, and that's this edition of Challenge 2.0. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.